So what I'm actually going to talk about is what I do day to day, or have done for a long time day to day, because I think I'm in a very unique position. I think there are few people actually in the world who visited as many patients with severe ME/CFS as I have over the last 6 years. And I haven't just visited each of them once, I visited them up to 5 times. So I think that's given me unique insight. And I racked my brains about a year ago trying to think how I could use this knowledge. The Biobank is a wonderful resource, and there are all sorts of studies, and I will talk about that briefly at the end, going on worldwide. But we are not making huge progress into either finding a diagnostic tool or to finding any treatment. So there isn't an awful lot I can talk about there. There are little things, and there's lots of very positive research in progress, but it is a long haul. So, visiting patients severely affected by ME/CFS, and it's how we can use a compassion in practice approach. So you all know that this is a hugely stigmatized disease. There isn't a diagnostic marker, there's no recognized effective treatment. It causes tremendous disagreement amongst the people who have it, amongst their physicians, amongst the people doing research. If you put people in a room together, they'll all have a different point of view. And that's really difficult when you're trying to actually positively look after someone with ME/CFS, and it is a very serious disease. It is potentially life-shortening. The Biobank project, of which I'm part, has actually been built on public engagement. So even before we began the project, we went to people with ME/CFS, we went to clinicians who looked after people with ME/CFS, and we asked them how we should go about researching it. And it's on the basis of what they told us that the Biobank project was established. Now, the Biobank itself is a repository of samples, and those samples are distributed all over the world. But we're part of the CureME team at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, and that team actually uses the samples to do its own research, and doesn't just use the samples, uses the data as well. So it is part of a bit bigger program, but it has all been directed by people with ME/CFS and the people who care for them and the people who look after them in a medical sense. We also have a very robust steering committee group, and we have some very robust discussions at our steering committees about how we're going to go forward, what sort of research we should be supporting, whether we can subsidise people seeking samples, and how we can empower studies that might not otherwise happen. So I'm sure you're all familiar with this, what really happens when you're diagnosed with ME/CFS. So we define the mild and moderate, the person mildly or moderately affected as someone who can still get up and around, and the person who's homebound and often bedbound for long periods of time, and sometimes indefinitely, are those that we define as severely affected. So how many people have ME/CFS and are severely affected by it? Well, 2 to 4 in every 1,000 is the general statistic for ME/CFS in total, and about 25% of those people seem to be severely affected. Now, there may be a huge group of people that physicians and researchers aren't accessing at the moment, so the real figure may be much higher. But in a GP practice of 10,000 people, about 40 will have ME/CFS, and probably 10 of those will be severely affected. And research that we've done at the Biobank have confirmed that people with ME, not with severe ME, but people with ME are actually more functionally impaired than people with multiple sclerosis or cancer, cancer, severe cancer, not just a skin cancer that's being treated or something like that, but somebody who's undergoing quite a lot of treatment for cancer. And the disease is recognised as life-shortening. And since between 2001 and 2016, there are actually 88 deaths recorded in England and Wales from ME/CFS. So, one of the problems with recruiting people with ME/CFS to a study is that these people are really generally off the radar. They're lying often in bed or in a darkened room. They sometimes aren't supported by their families. They almost always aren't supported any longer by their friends after they've had ME/CFS for a certain amount of time, and they really have little contact with the outside world. So how do we actually access these people? And that's taken a lot of work by a lot of different groups of people. We started with GPs in Norfolk and Norwich in particular, and by specialist services there. And they actually went through lists and they looked for people, and these people may not have been seen for years, but they then sent to us the numbers that they thought they had. We sent out invitation packs, which went out anonymously to GP services and specialist centres, and they approached the people. And we had an amazing response. We then had to put anyone who applied to take part in the research through a series of questions so that they would respond to an algorithm which would show which criteria they met. And unless they met the CCC or CDC and CDC criteria, we didn't actually accept them. And a lot of people were very disappointed, and they would get in touch with us and say, "But I've got ME." And we'd say, "Yeah, we know you've probably got ME, but unfortunately you don't meet our strict criteria. And for this study, I'm afraid you have to meet those criteria." So there was a lot of negotiation with people who weren't accepted in the beginning. And it's very expensive, because for every 10 packs we were sending out, we would maybe get one back, and then that one person might not be suitable. We were only looking for people between the ages of 18 and 60, and that's all to do with the fact that we don't have a paediatrician on board, and also because after 60 your immune system changes. So although you may very well still have ME/CFS, it changes when you're looking at different immune responding cells, and it's not a good group of people to look at. So we had a cut-off point at 60, and again people were very upset about that, and it took a lot of time to make people understand that they were still very much valued, but unfortunately they couldn't take part in our research. It was also obviously very difficult for people to engage in the research. They're confined to a darkened room if they've got severe ME, possibly. They're housebound. So the NIH very, very generously agreed to fund us going out to see participants. And because of time constraints on getting blood samples back to the Royal Free Hospital where they're stored, they have to be back there by 2 in the afternoon. And people with ME/CFS often don't wake up until 1 in the afternoon. You've got a very short window of time. So it meant that we were driving all over the country within a certain radius, because otherwise we couldn't get back to the biobank to see people. When we got there, people had maybe been waiting. We were maybe the first contact with anyone who'd shown an interest in their disease for some time. And of course, if they had the energy, they would be spilling out to tell us about their illness. And we had to be really relatively brutal and say, "We're not here to talk. There isn't time. We're going to leave you lots of questionnaires and you can fill them in. Take your time, tell us everything. But actually what we've got to do is clinically assess you and take the bloods." So that was quite difficult. The original funding for the study actually came from 3 charities and a very generous private donor. And without that seed funding, we probably never would have got the grant from the NIH. And we've had a further grant from the NIH since then, and the MEA continues to support the actual storage of the samples. This is a very complex slide, and it's really to show that there wasn't bias in the way that we recruited people, that they were recruited through GP practices and specialist centres. They had to have a confirmed diagnosis of ME/CFS from a specialist before they could be recruited, and they had to meet our criteria. You can see how many people we started with and how many we got down to. Scheduling issues has been a problem. So up until a year ago, it was just me going out to see people severely affected by ME/CFS. And you know, people aren't awake, they're not alert in the morning, they can't get up. It isn't that they wouldn't get up. Even for something like this, they just can't, they just don't function. So even to make the phone calls to schedule the appointments took some time to think out and work out. We often get last-minute cancellations. People wake up that morning and they're just not well enough. And we have to just accept that it's cancelled, everything's cancelled, and we start all over again with the process. There's a lot of fear that we're going to introduce infection into homes. So we're very, very careful about things like never visiting with a cough or a cold, taking shoes off, lots of hand washing, just being very, very careful, because people with severe ME feel terribly vulnerable to infection from the outside. We've actually lost very, very few people to follow up. 11 people have now been followed up 5 times, and that's out of a total of about 80. Yes, about 80. But illness severity, being on antivirals, things like that, can stop us being able to visit, and we just have to delay. There can be a change in diagnosis. We've had a very few people. We had one person who phoned me up one day and she said, "I'm absolutely thrilled. Guess what? I've been diagnosed with MS." So I was a bit taken aback and said, "Well, why are you absolutely thrilled?" "Oh," she said, "well, people know about MS. They believe in MS." So I think, that gives some indication of just what people with ME/CFS go through. One of the things I looked at was using Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Self-actualization in severe ME/CFS, finding meaning and purpose in the face of uncertainty, is a really high aspirational goal. And it's just really getting through the physiological stuff right at the bottom of the heap, which is the major part of life of a person with severe ME/CFS. Ensuring they're safe. It's great if love and belonging is there, but sometimes I'm the only person going in who's touched them for months. They're just completely isolated. And I think it's really important that we teach people to recognise the dignity and value of a person with ME/CFS. And when I do go and meet people, I always try and find out a bit about the individual that preceded the illness. And that's just breathtaking, because you realise that this person who's reduced to such straitened circumstances that they can't move, they can't talk, they can't communicate, they can't see, they can't eat. They had these vibrant lives, and they tell me a little bit about it. And of course, one thing I noticed, I did a huge amount of work in mental health when I was younger. And people with depression would say to me, if I suggested they'd like to go for a walk, or they'd like to do something they used to do, climb a mountain, for example, "Don't say that, I can't even think about it." And if I say that to somebody who's lying prone in bed with an eye mask, with earplugs in, gently in a whisper, "Wouldn't you like to do it?" Oh, I would love to do it. I can't think of anything better, but my body just won't let me. And it's like a fundamental difference between people with ME/CFS and people with depression. And of course, people with ME/CFS do get depressed. Who wouldn't if those were the circumstances you were carrying on your life under? I hope you can read this. So we analysed the data that we collected from people with severe ME. The first column is the percentage of people with severe ME with those particular symptoms. And the second column is the percentage of those people who had severe symptoms. Does that make sense? So unrefreshing sleep, 100%. Disabling fatigue, 100%. Exercise intolerance, 100%. And these were some comments that I collected from people as they spoke to me. And people waking up in the morning, and it doesn't matter how long they sleep, they just feel the same. A good day is trying to walk through water, and on a bad day, the water becomes treacle. One man said to me, if my daughter cleans her teeth herself, that's it for a week. She can't do anything more. I'd love to know what one single day without pain was like. I've quite forgotten. And reading is like trying to listen to the radio when there's so much interference that you can only hear the odd word. And perhaps life is a bit like that too. When someone visits, I have to choose. I can eat a biscuit and have a cup of tea, or listen and respond. I can't do both. I'm so sorry, you just asked me to do something, but I can't remember what you said. And would you mind just shining a light just on my arm when you take the blood, right away from my eyes, because I can't tolerate any light. When you come to visit my daughter, don't wash your clothes just before you come. Please wear something that you've already worn a couple of times, because the smell of the detergent or the fabric softener is going to worsen her symptoms. And I'm going to write that down now, because otherwise I'm going to forget that I need to write it down. And sometimes I grasp at words, feeling like a toddler learning to speak all over again. There's difficulty in making decisions, retaining information, sleep problems, intolerance to standing and POTS, and you can see that 81% of people with severe ME have POTS, and 50% severe POTS. Now, you'd think if it was lying down in bed all day that it would be 100%. So it's interesting that it is only 81%. So it doesn't seem to be related to lying in bed. Intolerance to heat and cold, allergies, hypersensitivities. I see a couple of people who just cannot bear even to have clothes on their skin. It's just too much. Gastrointestinal symptoms are common, very, very common, as is sickness and nausea. So compassion, when I first started to nurse all those many years ago, I was told we were a nurse with our heart and our head and our hands. And I think these days it's much more about head and hands, and heart seems to have gone out of the window. But I think that when people need their disease acknowledged, when they need validation, and when they simply need compassion and understanding, compassion is one of the major tools that can be used, not just by nurses, by healthcare professionals, by the people who come to interview for disability allowances, by the people who come and clean the house. I think it's really, really, really important. So a few years ago, someone brought out a paper suggesting that compassion in practice involved compassion, care, competence, communication, courage, and commitment. And I thought I'd look at how these could be interpreted with ME CFS. So you can all read the bit on the left which tells you what compassion is. But I think compassion is really central to guiding all interactions with people with severe ME, and indeed people with ME CFS of any description. And it should be evident in everything you do, the way people are addressed, the timing, when you speak to them, how you speak to them, with whom you speak to them, the tone of voice. You know, I go into a room and I have to assess whether I'm going to speak in a whisper or hardly speak at all, or whether actually that person would like some banter. They're lonely, they'd actually like some interaction. allowing time, and particularly when you're a medical practitioner, allowing time for the tests that you're going to do. People can't answer the questions as quickly because of all the brain fog and everything else that's going on as your regular man in the street. And it's really, really important to make sure you allow that time. Maybe have the appointment last thing in the evening when you're visiting somebody so that you're not rushing back to a full surgery. Maybe only tackle one problem at a time. And decide, negotiate with the patient. What is it you want to talk about next time? And let's think about that. Let's prepare for that together. Care. So one of the things is that I take great care that I'm not going to actually cause by my visit that a patient is much worse the next day. Now, often they are a little bit shattered the next day. And sometimes they say it takes a week to get over it, but I want to be absolutely sure that they are getting over it. And if my visit means, as it did in one case, that the individual concerned took 3 months to recover, I don't go back, because that's not proper research, that's not ethical research. And I think that practitioners need to make sure that if they're interviewing for disability allowance, for example, that they're not leaving the patient so ill that it's going to take them months to recover. Prioritising the agenda according to need. One person's need may be pain, another person's need may be mobility, help with mobility. You need to assess when you're going in, as you would in an accident and emergency department or on a busy ward. Avoiding sensory overload, noise, smell, light. I've forgotten what it's like to wear perfume. I used to always wear perfume, and now I don't. And I reel if I sit behind someone in the cinema who's got perfume on, and I realise how invasive it is. And certainly I would never wear perfume to visit a patient. I wouldn't put on a strong fabric conditioner or anything like that. I talked a bit about infection, lots of hand washing. And sometimes people don't have the energy to talk hardly at all. And at other times, as I say, they're really wanting to tell me everything. And I have to say, look, write it down and tell us. So our poor data entry people sometimes have reams of information to put in, but none of it's ever wasted. Competence. One of the things that's most threatening when you go to see people with ME/CFS is that it often seems that they know much more about it than you do. And I think that's very threatening. We're used as practitioners to being the people who know best. And we really do need to listen to our patients much more carefully. If they say something that we know is wrong, and we're sure it's wrong, then of course that needs to be corrected. But in the same way as we used to never listen to mothers, we now accept that mothers know most about how their children are, and we listen to them very, very carefully. And I think in the same way, we really, really have to listen and hear what people with ME/CFS have. We need to acknowledge where we stand. I don't know, but I can go and find out, and I will go and find out, and I'll come back to you with that information. Charities are a tremendous source of information, and pointing the patient, often patients are networked with iPads, computers, phones. They can get hold of information if they know where to go. And helping to pace. Now, this isn't graded exercise therapy. This is saying, they say to me, look, maybe it's going to take me a week to fill in that form. And I can say to them, look, it's fine. If it takes a month, that's fine. There are a couple of bits. Think about how you were today. There are a couple of bits you'll need to remember and fill those in. But don't worry, do it in your own time. And I think that can be terribly reassuring. And being aware of disability benefits, aids, all the things like that. And again, if you don't know where to find out. Listening implies great trust. So take time to hear and interpret, helping the patient to make sense of his or her experience. It can be enormously reassuring to say, do you know, I've heard that before, or you're not the only person who feels that. And you don't have to break confidentiality, but you can say, yeah, that's familiar. Seek clues, as I said, about the former person. People with severe ME/CFS have often had to redefine themselves completely. They are a shadow of the person that they were before. But if you dig a little, that person's still very, very much there, alive and well, just very hidden. And I think one of the most important things we can do is validate the individual in their illness. I see patients who don't have family. The family said, oh, don't believe you, you just work shy. Wives or husbands leave. They're bored, they've had enough. There's competition on the scene. The friends, well, they start off coming, but then gradually they tail off, because what do you talk about if you've lain in your bed for a week and you can't even watch television or listen to the radio? And so these people can be tremendously isolated, and making them sure of their self-worth, that they really are valuable just as they are, is so important. So I think, as far as courage goes, that it's actually the patient who needs the most courage. We as practitioners need very little in comparison. They face social isolation, their role is often lost, their identity, the relationships break down, and hope and poverty. You know, poverty raises its ugly head. I go to people who say, I'm really sorry, I knew you were coming, and I bet you'd like milk in your tea, but I'm really sorry, I can't afford to just buy milk for you coming. Do you mind having it black? And of course I don't mind having it black, but I'm horrified that people can't buy a pint of milk if they need to. And the practitioner, of course, does need courage. They need courage to admit that they don't know very much about this illness, that there aren't any effective established treatments for this illness. And actually, that's a really hard thing to say to somebody. So I think practitioners do need some courage, but not nearly as much as the patient. Commitment. The research shows that people with severe ME/CFS don't get better very quickly. They may deteriorate and they may stay in the same condition for many years. So the practitioner really does need a commitment. If you're a GP, if you're an occupational therapist, you need to be committed to going back to not getting bored with what you want, when what you wanted to do doesn't seem to be reaping any rewards. I talked about breaking up appointments, supporting patients as they embrace things that don't seem at all scientific. But if they help, being there as a support. Obviously, if they don't seem to be safe, then you need to say something. But most things aren't unsafe. And I think encouraging people is great. And when money and hope run out, because they've tried that, and still nothing works, then still be there with that commitment. Continue to be there for them. And remember that people with ME/CFS have comorbidities. They are going to get things like heart disease. They're going to get things like diabetes, just the same as all of us. And so you need to be watchful for those diseases and ready to pick them up and then treat them, and be aware that, you know, it isn't just ME/CFS. These are people just the same as any other patient. So what have we learnt from people with severe ME/CFS? So we've been able to further quantify disability in ME/CFS, and actually there are some handouts with what's called a spider graph, which shows where people with severe ME/CFS sit compared with people with MS, and it's really quite staggering how much more disabled they are. We've been able to show that hand grip is markedly affected in people with ME/CFS, and particularly people with severe ME/CFS. So I asked people to squeeze a dynamometer, which looks a bit like an instrument of torture. And the first time, if they can register anything at all, and often people with severe ME/CFS don't register anything, not even, they don't get past the 0. But if they can, let's say they get to 10. If they had MS, they would do 10, and then they'd do 10, and then they might do 8. If they have ME/CFS, they often do 8, 2, none. They just can't bring it up to the first reading at all. And they say to me, oh, that one was better. Well, it wasn't. We looked at low levels of CPK, and we actually found that they were very much lower in people with ME/CFS. Not everyone, but statistically lower. And in people with severe ME/CFS, they were markedly lower. So that's something that we're doing more research into, and that promises to be exciting. These are people to whom we've sent samples, and you can see that quite a lot have gone to people within the UK and to prestigious institutions. Scotland, Brazil, Spain, Israel, Europe, Austria, and the US. We do have problems getting samples out. We'd quite like an empty biobank. We don't actually want to hoard these samples. We'd really like them to be being used. And actually getting people to apply for samples is quite difficult. So we had a competition. We used money raised by a big give a couple of Christmases ago, and 2 lots of these samples, one lot which went to Bristol, I'm sure that's down there, no it's not, and one lot that went to Austria was funded by that big give. So that's really exciting. And all this research is bringing back little incremental differences. We'd love to say there was a huge breakthrough. There hasn't been yet, but we're very optimistic. When we had some of the first results, we asked people with ME/CFS to come back. We brought them down to London, we put them up in hotels, we drove them in taxis to the venue, and we asked them what they thought about these quite small differences in the research that we'd done and what we'd shown. And they were actually quite excited because they realised there is a big distinction between mild and moderate and severe. And so that's heartening. If you've got something really badly, you want something to show that it's really bad. And it seems that things like the hand grip and the CPK do. And although we haven't got a magical cure, they don't know how long it's going to take, they do feel that the resources there and that it is going to facilitate more research. This is the CureME team. When we started off, there were just 4 of us, and you can see that it's grown. We have a great project manager that some of you may know from social media. He's actually a musician, came to us knowing nothing about ME/CFS, and he's one of our biggest advocates now. We have 2 lovely young research fellows who work full-time for the project. They're full of enthusiasm, full of great ideas. And we're overseen by some more mature professors at the LSHTM. And we have Nuno, who actually comes from Portugal and will be working in Germany, but he is actually working alongside us looking at the results. Tane is a geneticist, and we have a very good biostatistician, Luigi, and we have a new project coordinator who's helping Jack, because he's being sought for other projects. Luis, who is our co-PI, is actually working at a very prestigious job on Vancouver Island, and he commutes. So 6 weeks he's in Vancouver and 2 weeks he's with us. But we're obviously in touch all the rest of the time. But it has been sad to see him go, but he felt it was an opportunity that he couldn't miss. So, just some recent news from the Biobank. So we've actually got 2 agreements, 2 collaborations going forward. One with a team in Australia who are trying to set up a biobank using all our SOPs and all the questionnaires that we already use, and the same thing in Canada. So it's really exciting. It looks as if we're going to have biobanks in 3 different places, which is going to make the samples that much more valuable. But I guess most of all, I'd like to say thank you for the people with severe ME/CFS who've welcomed me into their homes. That sometimes involved throwing keys down from a 3rd-floor window. It sometimes involved me trudging across muddy fields with my bag to get to a canal boat. All sorts of scenarios. But wherever I've gone, I've always been made to feel so welcome. And they've shared their challenges, their joys, their dreams, and their inevitable losses. And really, it's been a privilege throughout. Thank you.